Hello and welcome. And in this section, we're going to take a look at one of the more challenging services that we oftentimes deploy here at the competition for you to take on, and that's DNS. So I think one of the first things that's useful to do when we're taking on DNS is just understand the basic idea of what it is that we're trying to accomplish when we go configuring the software, configuring the service, because this is definitely a service that has a lot of different configuration files, a lot of little nuance to it. And so it's useful to take a step back and just see what it is that you're doing on the big picture. So I've made this simple little graphic to try to help us understand, realize that DNS is a server that you can ask questions to from a client computer. And there's two basic types of questions that we're going to be taking a look at and tackling in this section. And that is one on top here, which is a forward lookup, and then the one on the bottom, which is a reverse lookup. And so as a client computer, you can go to a DNS server and say, I have a domain name. Can you please tell me if you know the IP address that's associated with this domain name? So the client here is showing on the top in the forward lookup, hey DNS, where is ncaecybergames.org? And then the DNS server, if it has a record of that inside its configuration, it would be able to respond to the client and say, oh, this is the IP address that you're actually looking for. In the case of a reverse lookup, you get the complete opposite of this, where the client will go to the DNS server and say, hey, I have an IP address. Can you please tell me, is there a domain name that's associated with this IP address? So then the domain's name system, that your DNS server would be able to respond with the appropriate domain name if it's something that it's been programmed to look at. So that's what we're going to try to tackle here is let's see if we can get a DNS server functional. Let's see what some of these files start to look like. Let's start to take a look at a couple of the important pieces. I definitely want to emphasize with a lot of this, realize that there isn't necessarily one correct configuration that's going to work across all different types of Linux computers, right? If you're on an Ubuntu desktop or on an Ubuntu server or on a CentOS server, like some of these files might look a little bit different, but I'll try to at least point out these are the big moving pieces that you should be looking to tweak and fine tune. And if, by the end of this, if you're successful, you should hopefully have a server that you could then query from a client, you could make requests to from a client, and the server would be able to respond with some of this information. So let's see what it is that we can take on this. Let's give it a try. Okay, so I'm going to switch over here to my mini-hack deployment, what I've been working on, and a lot of the software that we're interested in trying to explore has actually been added to our Ubuntu desktop machine. So I'm going to pop this one open. We will be bouncing around to a couple of the other machines here throughout this section, but many times to start, we're going to have this computer act as our server, and so let's see if we can get the server itself set up, configured, and making queries just within itself. And so as a DNS server, you'll be able to ask yourself, do I know the answer to my own question or not? And then from there, we'll expand our way out and start making those same types of questions, those same type of lookup requests from some of our other computers across our mini hack topology. So, okay, so we've set this up to be an SSH server. We set this up to be a web server. So why not? This computer will just kind of continue to act as our server, and that's what we'll take a look at here in these activities. So first thing to check, like let's remember my IP address, right? I do my IPA and I could see this was a 192.168.mynumber.2, and my number happened to be 8. That was what got randomly assigned to me. So 192.168.8.2, this is kind of where the server is and where all the magic is happening, at least for now. And that'll be important to keep in mind as we consider that this isn't a standalone device. This is a server that other clients are going to be making requests from. Okay, now within this server, within this 192.168.8.2 device, where are the important configuration files for a DNS server? And the server that we're likely to give you for DNS is what's called bind, B-I-N-D. So bind is something that you could go and learn about. You could do an internet search for that, find lots of relevant information, lots of help documentation. But after all is said and done, many times you're going to be given a folder after bind has been installed that's likely going to exist inside etc, right? That's where a lot of our program files end up getting installed to. So yeah, inside etc, you probably have a folder that contains your bind configuration files. Now, if you're on an Ubuntu machine, it's probably called bind, B-I-N-D, so /etc/bind, right? And let's try going there, right? Just like we did with SSH, we could cd over to /etc/bind, and we'll see that this is indeed a location that has some files and things that we could start looking at and exploring. If you're on a different operating system, something like a Cent-based operating system, one of your Red Hat-based operating systems, it might be in a different folder. Bind might might not be a folder that actually exists. Now you'll notice this bind service has some configuration files right there inside it called named. And if we check to see what is the name of the service that's running, that's another thing that likely will come up, is that named. And so these are two words you can start to somewhat use, to kind of mean the same thing. We're talking about the same thing. If we're talking about named, if we're talking about bind, I'm not saying they're synonymous, but you're probably talking about the same thing if you see websites that are referring to these things. And so really where I'm going with this is something you could check with systemctl, right? We could do a systemctl status, and then if you try doing something like what's the status of bind, on many computers it's going to say, well, bind isn't the name of a service that's actually running. That might be the folder location, but that's not the name of the service that's running. But the thing that probably is running is that guy right there, that named thing. So let's try that. Systemctl status. Oops, we got a whole bunch of letters getting tossed in there. Systemctl status, and then named. We'll try that one. We'll see, that one is indeed something that's been installed here on the computer. It's not currently running. It has been installed, but it's not currently running, right? It's not active. It's currently disabled. And here's where you get it, right? named.service, and here it is, bind domain name server. So this was some software that we went and installed on these computers. It doesn't normally come with Ubuntu. It doesn't normally come with Send. It's something that would get specifically added for you to configure this device to now act as a DNS server. So, okay, we're exploring some of the important locations. We're seeing some of the names of the services that we're interested in. And now we get to kind of explore this, in this particular case, on an Ubuntu computer, /etc/bind, to see what the heck this is all about, what's inside here. Now, immediately our eyes should be drawn to those .conf files, right? We got those conf files. And why don't we start with one of the simplest ones, the named.conf. Yeah, let's take a look at that one. All right, maybe I'll open this with like nano. I'll do like a nano. And then what do we got? named.conf, right? We're inside /etc/bind, and then named.conf. And it says, hey, this thing is unwritable. If you wanted to make any changes to this stuff, obviously we're going to need a lot of sudo here today to go in and set up a DNS service. But you'll notice this particular file on this deployment, it doesn't really have very much information in it. And actually, when you look at the lines that aren't actually commented out, right, these are all just sort of notes at the top, you see it actually has 3 include statements. And so this is a good example of how many times you set up your DNS server in such a way so that you have maybe 1 or 2 or 3 primary configuration files, and then you would add in other configuration files with include statements from there. So you almost have like this tree branching out structure that you oftentimes start with your primary configuration file. Information could be tossed in there to actually configure your DNS server, but many times it will be included coming from other configuration files. And so this particular case with a fresh install, you see, they don't really give us anything. Everything has been included in these include statements coming from other configuration files. Not necessarily the default thing of what you might get on every system, but it's important to understand this is where those includes start kicking in. This is where you really have to realize there isn't just one configuration file that matters. I'd also like to emphasize that you're really getting into how do you want to set up and structure all your configuration files. I've seen some organizations where they take all of it and they just stick it all in one. And it's like, nope, we're going to have one configuration file that has all of our configuration. And it gets really, really long and kind of messy. And it's like, okay, fine, if that's how you want to do it. And I've seen the complete opposite where it's like, nope, I've got everything has been, broken out into tons of configuration files. And so you got like one main configuration file that has a whole bunch of includes. It just goes include, and you kind of just keep adding in all these extra configuration files. So it probably makes sense to be somewhere in the middle of that, to have including things, but depending on how complex of a server you're setting up, you very likely might want to start separating some of the parts that you're going to set up into multiple files. And you can manage some of your information within files, and some of it you'll manage it between the files themselves. So anyways, let's take a look at these though. That's really where I'm getting at here, the /etc/bind, then there's a named name.conf.options, name.conf.local, and named.conf.default-zones. Like, yeah, let's have a quick look at those. I'm not actually going to make any changes to this primary one, but let's start kind of snooping around and seeing these other ones, right? These other .conf files that are also located inside here, just so we can start to get a feel for what's actually around in our folders after the service has been installed, right? So if we do a named.conf, and then maybe I'll take a look at the first one, -default zones, and you can see, hey, there's some information in here, right? Prime the server with knowledge of the root servers, okay, localhost. We've got some information in this one. It goes down a little ways. You'll notice it even starts to reference some other files in here. Right? I haven't gone over exactly what all these lines mean yet, but you start to notice there are some of the other files inside /etc/bind are actually referenced inside this configuration file. We've got these DB files, db.0, db.127, db.local. Like these are the things that are referenced within this this particular file here. It's like, okay, we'll come back to that one a little bit, but at least we're starting to explore it. And here's those DB files, right? There were some other files that were located inside this /etc/bind location. Okay, let's take a look at some of the others. All right, we'll take a quick look at one of the named.conf.local files. And it says, okay, we got do not include local configuration here, considering adding zones, blah, blah, blah. It's like actually everything is currently commented out in this file, so it seems to be somewhat of a placeholder for other things, but currently not added. Okay, fine. Like it's there. We're kind of realizing what's there. Let's take a look at that last one, the last named.conf.options. And it's like, okay, the options, we've got a directory that's been added in here and into some of our options. Again, a lot of this stuff has been commented out. Looks like there's this forwarder spot that's been commented out here. It's telling us it's unwritable. Yeah, we didn't open this with sudo, but that's okay. And we're currently listening on any address. It's like, yeah, and then there's the end of this file. But it looks like they've kind of got a structure here that you could start adding in some options. So this is a good first look. A good first look to realize our primary configuration file includes some other files, and some of those other files were just sort of set up as placeholders where we can now add in more information. Others were actually starting to reference some of these DB files that were also located inside our /etc/bind location. It's like, okay, we're starting to explore this. Let's see, how do I actually go about doing things? If I want to take on the problem, like I was showing there in the graphic, so that a client could ask me a question, who has this address or what domain is associated with this address, how can I set it up so that my bind server, my DNS server, actually responds to those types of requests? All right. And so we'll have to just acknowledge here for a moment that, well, in order for this to actually be something we can test and try out, we would need a website. And so we can say, hey, we actually already have a website, right? Like this is something we did as we configured the mini hack itself. Right, if I go to my own IP address, 192.168.8.2, if I type in the IP address here correctly, let's go ahead and type in 8. Right, we have this file is owned by teammate. Like I do have a website running right now. So realize what I'd like to try to get to the point of is, what if I wanted this website to be referenceable from a DNS server, so that if I were to go to my browser, I could type in a domain name instead of typing in the IP address. That would be a good goal to get to. In other words, I could open up a new tab, I could type out the name of the site, and then this particular page would load. But let's see if that's something that we can accomplish. So acknowledge, we have a website currently at 192.168.8.2. There's content there. And if we program our DNS server to tell any client that comes to us, this is the website that's associated with the domain, then the client will respond to that. The client will trust the DNS server to say, okay, I've been told by the DNS server, this is the IP address that I need to go to. So why don't we try to do this, and actually we'll kind of do a little play on the main website for our competition. So we've got that ncaecybergames.org, right? There's a website we could actually go that's a real website. Now in of course our mini hack environment in the sandbox, we've been cut off from the internet, and so we can't actually get out to the DNS servers and go to the real page ourselves, right? That's currently how things are. If I try going to ncaecybergames.org, it's like this can't be found. We weren't able to get out to a DNS server. We weren't able to figure out where this is actually located. But that'll be our goal. Our goal will be, let's tell the DNS server, if anybody asks for NCAE Cyber Games, we'll send them here. We'll send them to this page. This will be the IP address that will be associated with that. And we'll do the reverse. If somebody gave us a reverse lookup and said what domain is associated with 192.168.8.2, we'll tell them, well, that's NCAE Cyber Games. All right. And so that will be a good little practice for us to go and see the necessary moving pieces for what it is that we need to configure with this. And so we'll be able to test that here in a little bit, and we'll be able to test it kind of from a few different machines as we go about doing this. So, okay, great. So let's continue this further and see what are some of the important configuration files that we're going to need to modify to actually go and set this up and make this a reality. Now, one of the most important ones that we're going to need to modify here is actually going to be within some of those zones that we saw earlier, this default dash zones, all right? So this file right here has been set up so that some of the basic zones, like the local host zone or the 127 zone, like these are things that are currently being referenced inside these other db.local, db.127 files, all right? And so this is how a DNS server could say, if you tried visiting local hosts, this is the IP address that you should go to. You should go to your loopback address of 127.0.0.1. That's something that's been referenced inside these. And so what we want to do is we actually want to start adding some additional zones. All right, and so that's something that we could do, and there's a variety of different configuration files that we could add this in. There isn't just one spot that we could add this in, but maybe to limit the number of files and make things as simple as possible, I'll actually add these zones into that default dash zones file, just so that we can kind of see the examples right there on top of each other. So this one I will actually do with sudo. So we'll do a sudo named.conf, and then we'll do the sudo nano, let's try that. Sudo nano named.conf.default dash zones. Like, yeah, let's actually go and modify this one now. All right. And so what I'm looking to do here as I do this, whoops, hit enter here a couple times. Let's get rid of all these extra spaces at the top. Okay, so what I'm looking to do here, all the way at the bottom of this file, is there are some zones that have already been set up, and I'd like to now start setting up some of my own zones. And so I'm kind of going to follow this same exact format of what you see here from the 4 that have already been added in. So I'm not going to modify anything that's been added. I'm going to come down here to the bottom of the file and add my own zone. Okay, so let's see if we can kind of dissect how does the zone actually work? Like what's the format of these zones? How does this actually work up here? And the answer is, of course, there's 2 different ways that we'd like to learn here that we could add a zone. Are you adding in a zone that's going to be used for a forward lookup? Or are you adding in a zone that's going to be used for a reverse lookup? That's what you need to now answer. And so the answer is, well, yes, I want to do both. So we'll create 2 zones. So let's do the forward one first. All right. So I'm going to add a zone. We're going to then put in quotes, what's the forward lookup address that someone might come to my server and ask for? And so we saw from a moment ago, I wanted to kind of do a little bit of a play on words and say, well, let's do a lookup for NCAE Cyber Games. .org. That will be if someone comes here looking for help with how to find ncaecybergames.org, then that's actually something my server will respond to. All right, so I'll close the quotes on that. We'll add in a little space. And after this, I will say the capital IN, in. All right, so in other words, I'm creating a zone and I'm telling the user, you're going to be able to find a reference to ncaecybergames.org inside some files that I'm going to create here in a moment. All right, so then I'll do my open curly brace. We'll hit enter here, kind of go on to the next line. Maybe for spacing, we'll kind of tab things over. This will be a master record that we'll create. So you see how every single one of these above says type space master. Yeah, sure, we'll kind of just duplicate that. Type This will be a master record. Okay, we'll hit a semicolon, go on to the next line here. And now you'll notice each one of these says, here's the file that will actually govern the response that I give if someone comes looking for ncaecybergames.org. Now, what I'd like to do, in other words, is I'd like to create a file. And this file, it hasn't been created yet. We'll create it here in a moment. But I'm going to take this file, and just like some of the others, I'm going to put it inside. Let's put it inside quotes, and then say /etc/bind/ It's like, well, here's some files that already exist. How about I create my own location for where I'm going to keep my files that I created? In other words, I'm going to make a folder. I'm going to make a folder called zones inside /etc/bind. This isn't mandatory. You could make the file right here inside this, but many times we take the zone files that we are creating for specific zones and we start organizing them. We put them in specific folders, you come up with specific names for them, right? Like that's the whole point of what we're trying to do with this, and that's why you start to see you get a lot of these include statements, you get a lot of these extra files you end up having to kind of keep track of. So, okay, so I'm going to have a file that I'll create in just a moment, and I'm going to put it inside a directory called zones. And after I do this, I'm going to have to name this file. And so to keep the name very, very clear, I'm going to use the word forward right there in the name. So in other words, I'm going to call this file, I'm going to call this one forward dot, how about NCAE Cybergames? Right, just so then everybody knows, like this will be a forward lookup for my ncaecybergames.org zone. Like that's the whole idea. I'm trying to make this as obvious and as apparent as possible as to what this is for. This is a forward for ncaecybergames.org. That's the name of the file that I'm going to make here in just a moment. And so I'm going to close my quotes. I'm going to close the semicolon there and then go on to the next line. All right, and on the next line, this is something that you might want to add. You can start to learn more as you do more with DNS servers. You learn oftentimes DNS servers will start chaining from one DNS server to another DNS server. They can start asking information and start modifying information that they get sort of along the way. But nevertheless, it is something that it's a common thing that you might want to add, and that's to say, do you want to allow updates or not? I could do an allow updates to this particular response, and maybe inside my curly braces, I'm going to say none, and then put a semicolon after that, space, and then close the curly brace, and then put a semicolon after that curly brace. All right, and you want to be real careful there with the spacing. Notice how I put spaces between the none and the semicolon, then another space, and then an actual semicolon at the end of the line. When I'm all done with this, I could go to the very next line, and let's close the semicolon for this particular zone, as well as, or close the curly brace for this zone, as well as put in a semicolon. So I've made another zone entry that's meant for my ncaecybergames.org, and they're going to look for the information in this file that I'm about to create called forward.ncaecybergames.org. That's where they're going to go looking if anybody asks, hey, DNS server, do you know where ncaecybergames.org is? Okay, I'd like to come up with another. I'd like to come up with another zone. And of course, the idea for this zone is, what if somebody shows up with the IP address? I want to have a reverse lookup. Okay, I want to have a reverse lookup. So if somebody shows up with my IP address, I want that to also to be able to respond to them and say, oh yeah, that's the IP address for this ncaecybergames.org that I'm kind of creating in my own little mini way here inside the sandbox. Now here's the confusing part of when you do reverse lookups. When you do reverse lookups in bind, bind will take the IP address and it will write the IP address in reverse. Oh boy. So that's a real important thing to understand. Reverse lookups, when they're being done in bind in these configuration files, bind wants you to write the IP address in reverse order. So what was my IP address? 192.168.8.2. So as I write some of this information, I'll have to start thinking about this information as 2.8.168.192. Right? It's really, really confusing to kind of to learn about this, but this is what we would call a reverse ARPA address, and that's what you see on some of this other notation, this in-addr.arpa, to show that this is actually written in reverse order. You're actually writing the information of the IP address, but you're writing the information backwards. All right, so I know it gets really confusing. You'd have to go learn a little bit more about ARPA notation, reverse ARPA notation, if you wanted to learn more about this. There's a lot of websites that can teach you more about this. I'm going to kind of show you at least the minimum here of what needs to be done with this. Now, what information do I have to put here? I got to write this information backwards, but what DNS wants is it wants the network information for the IP address that someone might ask. So it doesn't want the full IP address. It wants only the network information. So remember, that's what your subnet mask differentiates, right? So the 255.255.255.0, right? Wherever there was a 255, that meant that corresponding number was a network, was network information in the IP address, as opposed to host information. Wherever there was a 0, there was host information, right? And so what I would need to put on this line is I'd have to acknowledge the network I'm connected to right now is 192.168.8, and I am device number 2 on that network. I am device number 2 on the 192.168.8 network. So if I need to create a reverse lookup zone, the network information written in reverse is the following. The network information written in the reverse is 8.168.192. Right? So there's the 192.168.8, but it's written backwards. And to say that we've written it backwards, that's where we add in this notation that you see above of .in-addr.arpa, right? That ARPA, and then you could close the quotes. So that's the zone that we're creating right now. And what this says is, if somebody comes to us and asks, can you please look up an address on the 192.168.8 network, Bind will take that request and look for the file that we're about to enter in right here. So just like before, we could do a space capital IN, right? We're looking at this information inside. Let's do an open curly brace, and we're going to have 3 lines of information again, just like we had with the forward zone, pretty much identical. But this time, instead of having a forward.ncaecybergames.org, we're going to create a reverse.ncaecybergames.org. So let's do it again. We'll have a type space of master, put a semicolon, we'll go on to the next line and say file, open quotes, /etc/bind/zone/reverse.ncaecybergames.org, close the quotes, do a semicolon, and then just like before, I'll do an allow dash update space, and then let's do a curly brace, space, none, semicolon, space, close the curly brace, put a semicolon, and then finally on the last line, we'll close the curly brace and add in one final semicolon. So I've added 2 more zones to this file. One of them is going to be a reverse lookup. One of them is going to be a forward lookup. If somebody comes to the DNS server and says, hey, I need you to resolve something for NCAE Cybergames, the bind server will look in this file to see if it can give an answer. If somebody comes to the server with a request, can you please tell me who has 192.168.8 dots something, then your bind server is going to look inside this reverse lookup file to see does it have an answer inside the file. That's what we're setting up inside these different configuration zones. So as we leave this file and as we save these changes, we have to acknowledge we put the domain name here for one file for the forward lookup, and we put the IP address written in reverse, only the network information written in reverse, all prepped so that we can have a reverse lookup file. All right, let's try it. Let's see if we can continue on and get this working. Control X, Y, enter to be able to save that. Okay, great. All right, so I just mentioned a moment ago, I'm going to make a zones directory, and inside that, I'm going to make a few files. So let's go ahead and make that, right? And if you try just making the folder here, mkdir, and I want to make a zones directory so that I can do this, of course it's going to say, well, permission denied, right? Because you're trying to create files inside etc. So of course we're going to need to toss a sudo onto this, sudo mkdir zones. Okay, all right. So now here's an important thing to understand is let's take a look at some of the files that are actually inside here. Some of those DB files that were already inside that default zones. Right, you'll notice that some of those default files that are already in here, they were already referenced, right? That db255, db.local, db127, db.0. Maybe we'll take a look at one. Let's look at the db.local file. Let's see what's inside that, right? I'm not actually going to change this. I'm just going to look at it. Okay, we're going to do a nano inside db.local. Let's see if we can look at this. Okay, so what are we looking at inside this particular file? It says, well, this is a bind data file for your loopback interface. Okay, so we've got some information. It looks like it's kind of spaced out through here. And then down at the bottom, we've got some more. Okay, so how do I read this? How do I read this particular file? Well, what they're telling you here is that if somebody came with a request for local hosts at our particular server with some kind of variable set in here, how long before this is going to refresh, etc., it's going to tell you, okay, we have a DNS server. And what we're going to do is we're going to respond with the IP address 127.0.0.1. All right, and so that's the general idea, of course, of local hosts. Whenever you do go open a browser and visit localhost, it sends you to a corresponding IP address that's going to be associated with whatever your localhost adapter might be, which for most computers, your loopback address, right, your 127.0.0.1. So it tries to resolve this. And so we're going to have a similar file to this. The file is going to look in a similar structure, but realize we're not going to use the file we're creating to resolve requests for localhost. We want our file to resolve requests for NCAE cyber games. That's what we have this forward and reverse lookup for. And you'll notice one of the files that's actually here is called db.empty. db.empty. It says don't edit this file, rather copy it, and then go ahead and use that copy. So you'll see they actually have this structured out for you already, and the purpose of this file in this Ubuntu deployment is that here's a good one to copy, so that you have something to start with. A bunch of the variables have already been filled in, the structure of the file has already been structured out for you, and you can go and make your necessary changes, and hopefully, if you can make your necessary changes accurately, while still following the structure of this file, you'll be able to get a functional DNS server when all is said and done. So, hey, there's a nice file to have, this db.empty file. So let's go ahead and copy that. We're going to copy this db.empty. We're going to put it inside that zones file, or zones folder we just made, and let's copy it twice. Once for the forward lookup and once for the reverse lookup that we just put in that zones configuration file a moment ago. So here we go. So I'm going to do a sudo copy db.empty, and I'm going to put it inside /etc/bind/zones/ and I'm going to have it called forward.ncaecybergames.org. Right? That was the name of the file that I just came up with a moment ago. And I'll hit an up arrow on this, and I'm going to say, okay, I also want one, just kind of clearing my screen here so you can see what I'm typing. All right, I'm also going to want one that's called reverse.ncaecybergames.org. So I just copied this empty file twice that can now be used inside a reverse lookup file as well as in that forward lookup file. Okay, cool. Now, some people try to make these files from scratch, and that can work. Many times it's better to copy something that already exists, and I'll tell you why right now by doing something like an ls-l. Let's look at the permissions. And when you look at the permissions of the things that currently exist inside this folder, look carefully, right? Because these DB files and this configuration files, notice the ownership of them. They're currently owned by root. And the configuration files also are actually belonging to a group called bind. All right. And so if you copy a file that already exists, it's going to keep a lot of that ownership that you already have. The other thing that it's going to keep is it's also going to keep the permissions. And notice the default permissions on these files is 644. Whereas many times when you make a file from scratch, it will create it with 664, not 644. So if you don't have the ownership correct and if you don't have the permissions correct, then you might have the right configuration files. They might be in the right place, but if the bind service can't access them, then yeah, your bind service just ends up not resolving things correctly. Also look at your zones folder that we made. We made this zones folder and it automatically went and assigned root ownership, put it in the bind group, and that's something that you might actually have to manually set if you're doing something like this with the CentOS deployment. If you're on a CentOS distribution or a Red Hat distribution, you might have to come in here and manually set the ownership, and you might have to manually set some of these permissions to be consistent with what bind is expecting. Ubuntu kind of sets some of this for us, knowing that we're going to be using this inside this directory. Okay, so let's go into our zones directory, and now let's check that same thing again, right? If I cd into zones and do an ls-l, we'll see I now have a forward lookup file. I've got this reverse lookup file. The ownership is already correct because I copied it from that empty one, and you'll see my permissions are also correct. So there's a difference between copying a zone file that already exists versus creating one from scratch and then typing out all the information. You probably have some ownership and permission issues that you're going to have to correct if your operating system didn't do it for you automatically. So, okay, so now our goal is going to be, in our previous configuration file, in that default-zones file, we said, let's go to the forward file. Let's go to the reverse file to get our answers. Well, this forward and reverse file has been copied from this empty file. So clearly these files are not ready to go yet, and so we're going to have to modify these. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so I'm going to do something like maybe a sudo nano and then go into the forward one. Sure, let's start there. Let's start with a sudo nano forward and then the ncaecybergames.org. Okay, now we'll start to notice here that in this particular file, you kind of see how they have semicolons at the very, very top, and then they have notes. So actually, when you look at these files, anytime you have a semicolon, it makes the rest of the line, everything else on this line, becomes a comment. All right, and so you can kind of see that here, how there are certain variables that have been labeled, serial, refresh, retry, expire, etc., and they're actually been commented out on the rest of this because there's semicolons in here. So be real careful with this, because as soon as you put semicolons on the line, like everything else you write on that line, it's not actually keeping that. All right. Now, here's some important things that we're going to want to do. Now, at the very top of this, remember, this file was copied from an empty template placeholder type file, and they just sort of stick in the local host name as this is the domain that you might want to have associated with this. It's like, well, we don't want the local host domain. Remember, we want that ncaecybergames.org. That's the domain that I want this to be. So after the @ symbol in SOA, where it says that local host, and then there's a period, I'm actually going to get rid of that part there. I'm going to get rid of that local host period part. And this is where I'm going to put the domain that I actually want this file to be governing. And that, of course, the domain is the ncaecybergames.org. That's the location I actually want this file to go and be to reference. Now, after this, they have a root.localhost as well. And so, again, I'm going to get rid of this local host information. This isn't something that I'm actually going to have inside my forward.lookup file. I will keep the root part so that this could be a root DNS entry, but I'm not going to have anything after the root, right? So I've changed the local host there from localhost to ncaecybergames.org, and then I've just got that final root part. Now, here's a real critical thing to learn as you're modifying these configuration files, these zone files, that every single time you come into this particular file, you have to increment your serial number here by 1 if you want your changes to actually take effect. So in other words, if you make changes to this file, but you don't change the serial number, then bind doesn't notice that you actually made a change to the file. Oh, okay. So anytime, it doesn't matter if you make a typo, if you open this file up and you modify something, if you add some, like whatever the change might be, just realize that's what this number is here for. It's for you. It's here for you to just start incrementing through. It's not a special number, other than you have to change it every single time you made a change to this file so that your changes actually get noticed. So right now the serial number's at 1. I'm just going to change it to 2. All right, so I backspace it out, change it to 2. If I make any other changes to this file in the future beyond this, I'll change that number to 3. I'll change the number to 4. I'll change the number to 5. I'll just start incrementing through this serial number so that bind can tell the differences between the different files that I've created. Okay, so now we get kind of down here to the bottom, and we see we've got this @INNS, and then we've got this local host part. Okay, so what bind is looking for here is actually, can you please tell me the name of the computer that's running our DNS server? Right, so the name of our computer actually becomes really important when we're doing bind configurations. And many times, it just sort of assumes, well, maybe the name of your computer is called localhost. Right, and because many computers, that is the built-in name. They'll have localhost at local domain. It just sort of sticks in a placeholder for you. But of course, right now, that's not actually the name of our computer. All right, so I'm going to have to backspace this out in our forward lookup. That's localhost is not the name of our computer right now. Well, what is the name of our computer? Well, this is something that I created as I made these computers for us to use in the sandbox. The name of our computer is actually called sandbox-ubuntu. So we'll have to put the name of our computer right here in this file so that we're saying this particular record is going to be governing the server that we're currently installed on. Okay, fine. So underneath this is where we can now start providing what are some of the domain names that are actually associated and what are the IP addresses that that match to them. All right. And so on this particular line is where you're going to start listing subdomains. And many DNS servers, you do want to include the name of your DNS server as a potential subdomain that you could go to. All right, so how would I do that? Well, on the very first line, this is where you would put the subdomain. So I could say my subdomain could be something like sandbox-ubuntu. Okay, and so what this file means is that if anybody visits sandbox-ubuntu.ncaecybergames.org, the bind will be able to find this line and then give the corresponding IP address that we assign to this particular location. Okay, so how do we now continue this? After this, I'm going to hit a tab. I'm going to hit a tab to kind of like space out the rest of this information. Now, the record that we're creating in a DNS server right now is what's called an A record. All right, so in other words, we could have sandbox-ubuntu space and then say in space A. All right, in space A. In A, we're creating an A record here. And our A record is going to have an IP address associated with it. All right, and so what is the IP address that's associated with our DNS server itself? It's like, well, the IP address associated with the DNS server itself is 192.168.8.2. Oh, okay. So if anybody visits sandbox-ubuntu.ncaecybergames.org, the DNS server will find the domain of ncaecybergames.org in this particular file. It will then look at the subdomain record listed here and say, well, I have an IP address that corresponds to that subdomain. That's kind of how the bind will be able to trace back through to find this information. Okay, that's a good start. Well, remember, if I go and visit a website, something like I want to go visit ncaecybergames.org, many times you don't just load the page that's located on the ncaecybergames.org. What actually happens is you get redirected to the www subdomain. So oftentimes you don't want to just leave this as is. You want to add in the www subdomain so that this www subdomain also has an IP address associated with it. So let's add that record as well. In other words, I'm going to add in, on the next line, I'll say www. Okay, and then I'll hit another tab. And maybe just for spacing purposes, I'll have them all line up all nice. I'll actually hit tab twice so that it's all lined up all nice here underneath this, because www is significantly shorter than sandbox-ubuntu, right? So, and then I'll do another in space A, and I'll hit a tab and I'll say, okay, if somebody tries going to www.ncaecybergames.org, where do I want them to go? And in this particular case, because my website is located on the same IP address as my DNS server, I'm actually going to list my IP address twice. I'll have the same IP address, 192.168.8.2. So many times your DNS server and your website, they're not necessarily on the same machine. Right, your DNS server might be on one machine, your website's on another machine, so your DNS server usually has to point to a different address over here. But because I'm kind of setting up one server to sort of be everything, that's why I'm actually entering in different subdomains can get redirected to the same IP address. And that'll be our initial example here that we'll start with. So this will be a good start. All right, these are the changes I'm going to make to this particular file here for a forward lookup. All right, so if anybody has a query for ncaecybergames.org, it'll go to this file. And in this file, we can resolve any of the subdomains that are listed on my list down here. So if somebody queries sandbox-ubuntu.com or sandbox-ubuntu.ncaecybergames.org, they will get 192.168.8.2. If somebody queries www.ncaecybergames.org, they will get 192.168.8.2 as well. Okay, cool. Let's see if we can make this work. I'll do a Control X, Y, Enter. I'll save those changes, and those are the changes that have been added to my forward lookup zone. All right, let's do the reverse lookup zone as well. Okay, so we'll do a sudo nano and then the reverse. And this file, right now, it looks very, very similar, and we're going to have to make some very, very similar changes to this, but with some very, very specific nuance to it. So this time, when I'm doing my reverse lookup files, you'll notice how the localhost has a period after the end. And so this time, I want to change this, but I want to be real careful that I keep the period this time. All right, so in other words, I'm going to get rid of the local host, but this time in the reverse lookup files, I'm going to keep the period. So I'm still going to have this file be for my same domain of ncaecybergames.org. All right, but this time it's going to end with a period. All right, and just like before, I kind of had that root and I got rid of the localhost dot. It's like, well, now I'll have the root, but I'll stick in that root.ncaecybergames.org period. So a lot of our reverse lookup files, you're usually going to want periods at the end of a lot of your domains, whereas in the forwards, you don't necessarily need that. Okay, just like before, whenever you might make a change to one of these files, increment the serial number. So I'm making a change to this file right now. I'm going to change it from 1 to 2. Okay, fine. What's the name of my DNS server? It's like, well, it's not called localhost. The name of my DNS server is called sandbox-ubuntu. So I'm going to do that. But just like before, this is a reverse lookup, so I'm going to keep that period on the end. Okay, now on to the next line. Now here is where we have to really understand how this is different, because remember, this is a reverse lookup file. So what this is going to go looking for is not the www.ncaecybergames.org part. This is actually looking for the IP addresses. So if somebody comes with an IP address, I could say what the domain is that's associated with that IP address. But remember what I was telling you before, the IP addresses are written in reverse order. Remember, there was a reverse order IP that was pointing to this reverse file. So in other words, we had the 192.168.8.2, and I've already written the 192.168.8 part in reverse. That part has already been written in the other file. So what I have to do now is write the host information, but I'm still writing it in reverse order. Okay, so what's the host information for this particular location? It's like, well, I've got 192.168.8. That was the network information, so it's only the 2 part. Okay, it's just 2, so thankfully the reverse part, it doesn't really matter, because 2 written backwards, still 2. There's only 1 octet here that we have to worry about. So if somebody queries 192.168.8.2, it'll find this file and it will now say, well, what's the domain that's associated with this particular file? Okay, now these particular records are different. These are not A records. So last time we had in space A. Well, these particular records are PTR records. So I could say in space PTR. And then I could hit some more tabs. And now this is where I'd write out, what do I want this to address to be located, to be referenced to. And this is where I could have something like, well, how about www.ncaecybergames.org, period, at the end. Okay, do not forget your periods at the end of domain names inside your reverse lookup files. So if anybody looks up 192.168.8.2, the DNS server will respond with, well, the domain associated with that is www.ncaecybergames.org. We also want to include the domain name server itself inside our records. But remember, in this particular case, the domain name server and the website, they're actually the same address. So you can have multiple IP addresses that might resolve to different names. So in other words, I'm also going to have 2. I'm going to have an INPTR record for this, but this one will resolve to what was the name of my domain name server itself. I could have something like sandbox-ubuntu.ncaecybergames.org, period. That could be another record that I would have that would be associated with this particular DNS server. Okay, so hopefully I've been able to type all this out correctly. Hopefully I don't have any typos in this file. Hopefully I got all my periods in just the right spot and my spaces, and I've incremented my serial numbers. So I can now hit a Control X, Y, enter and save that. So I've got a forward lookup zone. I've got a reverse lookup zone. Where were those referenced? I'm going to do a cd ... I'm going to get out of my zones file. And remember, where I was originally looking at this was in that named.conf.default-zones, right? Just as a quick remember here, it's like, hey, if anybody comes to this and says NCAE Cyber Games, it's going to look inside that forward NCAE Cyber Games file. If anybody comes with a 192.168.8 address, it's going to look inside the reverse to give an answer for that. That's what these files are indicating to my DNS server. Okay, fine. So I'll hit a Control X on that one. I don't have to make any more changes to this. So let's start to see, is any of this working? It's like, well, right now my service isn't started, right? When I check my system CTL status of name D, well, it wasn't running. I have a DNS server, I'm configuring it, but it's not actually turned on. It's not actually running, it's not actually resolving anything. Okay, well, let's see if I can give it a kick. If I configured everything correctly, hopefully I'll be able to start this. Let's see if I can start this. All right, so I'll do a sudo systemctl start name D. Oh boy, it didn't yell at me. Let's check the status, right? I'll hit a couple up arrows here and check the status again, and hey, it currently says running. We're currently running. Hey, so at least I have things in my configuration files that aren't flat out typos. If your service was not able to start, you'll have to start going through and troubleshooting your service to figure out, where am I missing a typo? Where am I missing a period? Maybe you're missing a semicolon. Maybe you just didn't have a space between one of those curly braces, space, and then the next variable. These files can be very, very sensitive with your spaces and your semicolons and all that stuff. But anyways, there's a lot of help online that you could find to be able to start troubleshooting things, make sure that they're actually typed correctly. Okay, well, how do I go about telling if this is actually working? Right? Like, how do I now do what these pictures said? Right? If I wanted to be a client and ask, what is an IP address or what is a domain name? Like, DNS server, please respond to me. How can I see if it's actually working in that sense? It's like, well, there's two good ways maybe that you might want to learn about. One would be you can query a DNS server right here at the command line. Another would be, it's like, well, I could just try going over to my web browser and typing it in and seeing what happens. Maybe we'll try that. Maybe we'll try just typing www.ncaecybergames.org, and what happens if I try resolving it? Oh, well, it didn't seem to work. Why not? Why was my computer not able to find ncaecybergames.org? And it's like, well, let's think back to our networking configuration. When I configured the networking for this computer, did I ever tell my computer where the DNS servers are? I guess I never did that, right? So in other words, if you think about that /etc/netplan file, it's like we added in a gateway and we added in an address, but we never said this is where your DNS servers are. So that is something that you could do. You can go into your netplan file and add in another line to say, this is where my name servers are. Name servers is a really useful word to start learning. So name servers, you're talking about a DNS server in Linux. Okay, so that would be one way to do it. The other file that I want to show us, just so that you're aware of some of the key files on your system, another really important file on our computers is actually in /etc, right? I'll cat out the file, /etc/resolv.conf, resolv.conf, no E on the end of that, resolv.conf, this resolv.conf. Okay. Now, this is a file that when you configure your networking, if you had a DNS server in your networking configuration, it should add a name server to this particular location. Okay, so on some operating systems, it's okay to come in here and just go and add any of your DNS servers right here to this file. Lots of times they recommend, well, why don't you add it into the netplan file, restart your networking service, and then see that it gets added into this particular location. So anyways, these are two different ways to kind of get to the same result. Maybe I'll just try adding it in directly here. And if it doesn't work, then I'll try to do it a little bit more the official way, and I'll add it into the netplan file, right? So I'll go into this resolv.conf. I'll use sudo to get into here, and I'll say, well, I don't want to use the name server there. I want to say my name server is actually 192.168.8 192.168.8.2. That's where the DNS server is currently located. So if you have to resolve a domain name, try to resolve the domain name at 192.168.8.2. Yeah, sure, let's give that a try. Control X, Y, enter. Let's try doing that. And let's see, you might have to restart your networking. Let's see if Firefox is now smart enough to now use the information that's listed in there. Hey, it worked. Notice how I refreshed the page. I went to www.ncaecybergames.org and it loaded the information that's actually located at my website here at 192.168.8.2. So to follow all this through, follow through what just happened. My computer in my browser sent a request to the DNS server when I typed out, please tell me www.ncaecybergames.org. It went to that resolv.conf file and said, what are the name servers that are currently on the list? Let's start with the first one. And so it went to 192.168.8.2 and said, hey, are you running a bind server right now? Are you running a DNS server? And the computer said, yes, I have a DNS server that's currently running here. Okay, can you please tell me, do you have a domain, ncaecybergames.org? And when we looked at the files that are inside here, when we looked inside this default-zones file, right, let's maybe cat that one out. I cat out the named.conf.default-zones. It said, oh, I do have the domain ncaecybergames.org. I'll have records of this inside my forward.ncaecybergames.org lookup file. All right. And so from there, it went inside that particular file. So I could cat out zones/forward and say, okay, I went into this file now and said, okay, the user is specifically requesting the subdomain www. Do you have a record for www inside that file? And the answer was yes. I have a record for www inside that file. And the record is, well, it's actually myself, 192.168.8.2. So that's how the DNS worked its way through the different settings and responded to the request when Mozilla went and made the request right here. Okay. Another way that you can make these requests is right here at the command line using a utility called nslookup. Right, so nslookup is something that comes many times on different Linux distributions. Sometimes on things like CentOS, this might not come standard, but this is something that you can install. You could go and install the ability to run the nslookup command. So with nslookup, you can do the DNS query without going and loading the web page. In other words, it does the first part that Mozilla did when we typed in the domain name here. It did the first part, which was make the DNS request. Mozilla, after it got the answer, went and then tried to load the page. So Mozilla took it a step further. But if you just want to make the DNS request, you can do that with nslookup. So with nslookup, you could type out, well, let's look up a domain, www.ncaecybergames.org. And it said, okay, I took your request and I went to 192.168.8.2. I then got a response from the DNS server at this location. That DNS server responded with, well, here's the IP address, 192.168.8.2. The website is actually at the same location as the DNS server. And you could do the reverse lookup as well. You could do something like an nslookup and say, who has 192.168.8.2? And it will tell you, well, there's actually two entries for that. I've got two entries. One of them is sandbox-ubuntu.ncaecybergames. The other one is www.ncaecybergames.org. Because the website and the DNS server are both hosted off of this same IP address. And I added both of them in as entries. Okay? So this is a nice little utility that you can use, understanding using things like nslookup, so then you can query things against the DNS server.